Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with a fun watercolor video using the new Blissful Bouquet stamp set that just came out at Simon Says Stamp. And y'all know me and my love of large florals. I was like, yes. I actually had a hard time choosing. I was like, oh, which images should I use? Because there's just these huge peonies in this set, and I love it. So I narrowed it down and picked up my little images, and I've got some Canson XL watercolor paper. Just put it in my mini MISTI, added some anti-static powder to the watercolor paper, and then inked up and stamped these images a couple times with clear embossing ink, because watercolor paper has, at least this watercolor paper, all watercolor paper has some texture unless it's a hot press, totally different story, but it has a little bit of texture, and I want to make sure I got everything stamped. So I stamped it, I coated it with white embossing powder, and before melting anything, I put just the individual leaf image onto an acrylic block and stamped that to fill in the rest of this, plus I wanted extra leaves. So I stamped it, coated that with embossing powder so I could see, because that's the thing when you stamp with embossing ink on watercolor paper, it is really hard to see it. So added the embossing powder. Once everything was coated, then I melted it with my heat tool, and you tilt it back and forth in the light to make sure there are no dull green areas, because again, you can literally see it basically disappears in a sense. So once I've got it all melted, I'm going to do some watercoloring with Simon's Pawsitively saturated inks. I've done this in many videos over the last however long, I'm not even sure, whenever they first started releasing these Pawsitively saturated inks. So with this most recent release, they've got a couple little sets of ink cubes in their colors. People have been asking for these, and you can't go wrong with ink cubes. They're just adorable, plus they're convenient. You know, especially if you don't have a lot of space. I'm one of them. I have, of course, the full size Pawsitively saturated inks, but I love me some ink cubes. I can have more colors in less space. So they've got two sets so far of there's the set of pinks, which are called, I'm not even sure what they call them. They gave them cute little names. They're pink blooms, fitting. And then there's the neutral set so far. More will, I'm sure, be coming. So I went with the carnation and peony and rose colors for my bloom, and I just mushed them onto one of my little palettes. And then I also used, I've got field, cadet, citrine, pine, and cappuccino, and I'll have links to everything like I always do. And I've super sped this up, but honestly it didn't take that long to watercolor these, because with the heat embossing, they're my little bumper pads so that I don't have to worry too much. You know, they keep things a little more contained, and I just don't have to worry about it, you know? So I'm legit just slapping the color on. I just used a wet brush, painted on water first, and then swirled it in the inks and started painting. And I just kind of went lightest to darkest with the pink colors. So I did carnation first, and then I went in and added peony, and then I went in and added rose, which is the darkest. And then and then at this point it's mostly dry, and I was just using a tissue to quickly wipe over the stamped and heat embossed image, because the inks were kind of sitting on top of a lot of the embossing. So I just kind of wiped away the ink so that the actual stamp lines show up a little bit more. And then for this little leaf cluster, this is where I mixed field and cadet, so the green and the blue. I was kind of thinking like eucalyptus leaf colors, you know? And then for the remaining leaves, I used pine, which this is a color I don't reach for often in any of my ink lines, because of course I have multiples. But every time I do, I'm like, oh, this is such a nice color. Like, as I was painting with it, I was like, ooh, I like this. And then I added just a little bit of brown, just you know, experimenting. And I quite liked how that worked. In fact, I went back And I added a bit more of the carnation to the flower, and then I actually added a bit of the brown too, just to mute it out, just a little bit. I'm definitely not one for the muted tones of things. You guys know this. My last video was like super bright rainbow cards, you know, that's just what I love. But I do love watching other people do like muted and softer tones and all of it. I struggle with that. You know, I want to add 15,000 layers and 3 different, you guys are going to see, I'm going to add 3 different kinds of bling at the end. But anyway. After I was done watercoloring them, I used the coordinating wafer dies. And when I tape wafer dies, I like over stamped and colored images. I always try to keep the tape off of the actual image. I tape from like the wafer die out so that when it runs through the die cut machine, the pressure doesn't like fuse the tape to what I've colored, because I've had that, although I was using Easy C tape and usually it's pretty good, but I would rather be safe than sorry. So I die cut everything, and I wasn't going to do a little watercolor background, but I was loving that pine ink so much. I just grabbed another piece of the Canson watercolor paper and just a wide flat brush, and I just painted that pine color along with a bit of the cappuccino color onto the background, trying to keep a lighter hand. You know, I didn't want it to be super intense, but the color, I don't know, I just loved it. So I did a quick little, you know, wash of that, dried it with my heat tool, and then I die cut it with, this is the new, it's called Modern Postage Stamp Rectangles wafer dies. And I like the edges of that. I was like, ooh, this is fun. It'll just give it a little extra something versus, you know, I just usually do just straight up plain old rectangles. So I die cut it with that. And then, I had everything laid out I'm just using an A2 piece of cardstock at the moment. Had everything laid out, and I just kind of kept it all in place and adhered all these elements with the craft tacky glue. And then the actual bloom, I'm going to pop up with just some thin foam squares to give it just a smidge of dimension, not a whole lot. But this also just helps adhere it because Canson XL watercolor paper is quite thick, and those layers of leaves already pop everything up. So the foam squares actually just help hold everything down a little bit more. So I even stuck one more in there, and I did all this separately because I wanted to stick this in my splat box to add splatter, of course, because splatter is life. If I could sing, I would, you know, I would impersonate Laura Basson and sing, you know, her whole thing. I talked about this, and I think just my last video, you know, how she sings Dimension is life. I agree with that, but I also think splatter is life. So, you know, anyway, took Ranger Perfect Pearl powder, put it on my little palette, added some water and my fan brush, and splattered that heavily onto this little panel. And then I also added gold watercolor splatter from my Kirtaki Starry Color set, or like the Gansai Tombai. So same thing, I'd work that up, use my fan brush, splattered that all over, and then let all that dry. And then for my sentiments, I'm using the Reverse Bold Hello sentiment strips. And I trimmed down the ones I wanted to use. And this one I trimmed down into 2 pieces because it's how I wanted it to, you know, fit onto this card front. And then I chose another one of the little sentiments in there. And I'm just using my little guillotine trimmer to trim these down. And once I've got my sentiments ready for the inside of the card, I'm using the Modern Postage Stamp Edges stencil set. So this coordinates with that wafer die. So there's a stencil set and a wafer die set. And the stencil's the same size as the wafer dies. So I put that on the inside of the card, and I grab that pine ink again. And this is like sped up in editing, but I'm using a very light hand. This is where I struggle. Because, you know, I want to stick that color on, you know, full strength intense, but this is the inside of the card and I want to be able to write over it. So I was working very hard at being just very light-handed. And this will smooth out more as it dries because the positively saturated inks do just like smooth out and they fade back a little bit. So I just lightly, and I kind of kept it a little darker in the lower left corner just cause. And then just lightly blended that all over the stencil. or inside the stencil. And then I taped the stencil in place with pixie tape. So I removed all that. And then I adhered my little sentiment strip there onto the inside of the card. So just keeping it simple. And then to adhere my little watercolor panel with the blooms, I put Simon's Big Mama foam tape on the back of this. My absolute go-to, you know. It gives a little bit of dimension, but it's not thick like regular foam tape. So I coated the back with that. Peel off the backings. Gonna stick that into place onto my card. And then once that's adhered, I'm going to adhere those little sentiment strips with more foam squares. Just kind of pop those up, give them some extra dimension. And then, like I said, as always, you could end here, but I'm gonna add bling. And I couldn't choose one, and I went with three different kinds of bling. Why not? Go big or go home. So as I'm like, this is a simple watercolor card. I just use like 30 different products to make it, you know, but isn't that card making in general, really? Honestly. Anyway, adhered the sentiments, and then Pink Fresh Studio glitter drops, because I'm just currently obsessed with them. What can I say? So I've got the three shades of pink from their like a little original release. So Blossom, Blush, and Magenta, because they just went perfectly with the pinks that I used to watercolor the bloom. So sprinkled those throughout the card. People ask me about this. Honestly, I just stick them wherever I think they look nice. You know, odd numbers, triangle formations, that's always pleasing to the eye. And yet at the same time, there are no rules, you know? There are rules, but there are no rules. Just do what looks good to you. So I stuck them into place with dabs of craft tacky glue. Once these were, and then I snuck in another one. It needed one more, because, you know, it just does. That's the rule. So once I was done, that finished off the card. As always, there will be links below the video to my blog post. Definitely worth checking out, because today's video is actually part of a blog hop. So there's going to be like tons of inspiration, giveaways, all the fun things. So that'll be linked directly below the video. I will also, of course, list and link to all of the supplies I used, the 80 different supplies. Those will be linked below as well as on my blog. So you can check that out below if you're interested. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos, for thumbs upping and commenting. Subscribe if you haven't. I would love to have you. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.